What I'm working on here today is my e-mountain bike, which has taken to spontaneously breaking spokes recently. And the wheel in question is a Crank Brothers Synergy 29-inch rear wheel. And what I hope to show is that a relatively persistent individual can do this, but you do need some tools. And so this one, you can see the broken spoke here. And where this gets slightly complicated or perhaps irritating is the spoke is drive side, and that's a pretty common place for them to break. And it also broke right at the first thread where the thread goes into the nipple. Now, those two things mean a couple of things. One, you can't get the spoke out, or more importantly, get a new spoke in unless you remove the cluster, move the cassette so that you can bend the spoke out, rotate it this way, and then shove it out through the other side of the wheel. So at minimum, you need to be able to remove the cassette. Two, when the spoke breaks at the first thread, it leaves the nipple in the rim, and so you have to take the tire, the tube, and the rim tape off so that you can shake the nipple back out before you put the new one back in. So repairing the wheel brings up a couple of questions. In this case, this is the second spoke that has broken at the first thread. So there are 14 more drive side spokes from the same manufacturer in the same batch on that side of this wheel. I would be silly to not think some of those others would not break. So with that in mind, what I really ought to be doing here is rebuilding at least that entire side of the wheel and perhaps the entire wheel. But for today's effort, I'm going to give it one more try, and I'm just going to rebuild. I'm just going to replace that single spoke, and hopefully it was only 2 bad spokes out of 16, or excuse me, 16. So anyway, that's what we're going to be going back today. Something you can do that helps get the first one started is thread the nipple backwards onto a spare spoke. That way you can hold it in the hole while you get the new spoke started. So with that, we have the nipple started on the new spoke. When you're dealing with a whole bunch of spokes and you're rebuilding a wheel and you've only replaced one, sometimes it helps to put a mark, like a piece of tape or something, on the spoke you've replaced so that you know which one you're working with. And generally, if it's a good wheel, if it was built properly to begin with, and Crank Brothers builds a lot of wheels, so you kind of have to trust them to true it, get it round and true. When you replace the spoke, it should come back into true pretty easily, mostly by working with just that spoke. Something, if you're rebuilding a wheel or building wheels or rebuilding one after you've bent spoke, it really helps to have some sort of truing stand. And you can spend the world on truing stands, or you can get them pretty cheaply, or you can make one yourself out of a couple pieces of aluminum and a handful of thread stock. This one has been serving me pretty well for the better part of 40 years. You also need a dishing tool to make sure you've got the rim centered between the dropouts. And when you lose a single spoke, the lack of tension from this side tends to mean the rim bulges out on this side, and that's what you see. We're going around here. It looks pretty crappy from that angle. So not surprisingly, the narrow spot is right there. So as we have to do anyway, we're going to tighten that spoke and we're going to bring it back into true. Something you'll notice when you start getting the spokes up to full tension. If you watch the tape here while I tighten the nipple, you'll see it moves. What you're doing is you're winding up the spoke a little bit. So as you get up to the final setting for the spoke, it's pretty good to say turn it and then back off, say an eighth of a turn or so to unwind the spoke. So at this point we're getting pretty close. If you look here, we've got maybe a couple millimeters out of true. That's not too bad. And at this point you want to check the dish. So using my homemade dishing tool, I've got probably $4 invested in this. The dish looks pretty spot on at that point. So at this point I want to pull it down here And I can see here I've got maybe 2 millimeters between my indicator and the rim, so that's what I want to look for. And it looks like I've got a little high spot here, which might be residual from that other spoke, because each spoke affects pretty much all other spokes. And so in relatively short order, that's looking like a pretty good true rim. And at this point, I'm ready to start putting it back together. A little post-mortem and a little bit of spoke theory, if you will, and it's kind of dodgy. The spoke that broke and the one that broke previously, which is this one, are both drive side spokes, and every spoke has an equal and opposite spoke going the other direction. In this case, there's pulling spokes, so that when you apply force to the chain and you try to rotate the wheel, the driving force goes onto the pulling spokes, and opposite them is the pushing strokes, if you will. They don't really push so much as the tension eases a little bit when you apply force. So you expect, when a spoke breaks, you expect typically for them to break at the J part. That's a pretty common place for them to break, particularly if you don't tension the wheel tight enough, because in a loosely tightened spoke, there'll be a little flex here with each movement of each rotation of the wheel. That flexes a little as the force applies and gets reduced. So that's a pretty common place for them to fail, particularly on the pulling spokes. Now both of these failed, and those are the pushing spokes, if you will, and they both failed at the leading edge of the at the first thread going into the nipple, which is a pretty unusual place for them to fail. So hopefully I'm going to put the wheel back, having just replaced the broken spoke, and hopefully it won't happen again. If it happens a third time, I'm replacing the whole set. So that's about it. From start to finish, I've got about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours into this, with an intermission for a rather long coffee break. The wheel's true, should be solid, but then it should have been solid before. Total tools involved is you need a cassette wrench, a chain whip of some kind. This is my handmade job from about 40 years ago. You'll need the usual tire tools to get the tire on and off. You will need spare spokes and nipples. And you may not know the size of the spokes until you take it off and have something to measure. So you may have to go down to your local bike shop. And for what it's worth, at least on name brand wheels like these, Crank Brothers is good enough to publish a technical sheet that tells you what spokes to buy before you get it. For instance, this is drive side are 292s, and the non-drive sides are 290 millimeters. You don't need a dedicated truing stand, but it makes life a lot easier. You'll need a spoke wrench, and it really helps to have a dishing tool of some sort. And this shows what a fairly dedicated individual can do without spending a whole hell of a lot of money on anything except the bike. So with that, it's the Old Farts Garage signing off.